in some schematized way, the same thing. We handle them in some ways the same way. Now, the polysemous categories are organized. I'm back to what the theory looks like now. And they are organized around a prototype. The term is used, it's been pointed out to me that it is not the same use of prototype as in Ford is developing something brand new in a car and they're going to display a prototype at the next engineering meeting or whatever, meaning a model that hasn't been developed yet. This is a use that comes out of cognitive psychology, the work of Eleanor Rosch from Berkeley and a whole gang of her students and other followers, on the idea that when people want to understand language, they compare to a best instance. What you have, I've never thought about it in terms of mental storage, but maybe that's part of it. You have best instances of these multi-meaning words. So if something new comes in, you compare. And you make decisions about how close to this best instance the other instances are. George Lakoff's example, which still holds up nicely as a way of getting used to this idea, is the meaning of the word bachelor. Okay, the prototypical bachelor is unmarried and male. But if you ask questions like, is the Pope a bachelor? You're all not laughing, but normally you get a giggle, at least from a class. And then you start getting into, well, it's not just unmarried to be a bachelor, but one of the other pieces of it is potentially marriageable, potential to marry. So that we might have an 80-year-old bachelor, if we had that as a phrase that we're trying to make sense of, not as good an instance of bachelor as your 30-year-old. We'll say that age is one of the phenomena that enters into it. A monk would not be a good bachelor. Unmarried male, but no potential. And so on from there. And sets get organized in this way, so that there's a core, the prototype, the best instance, and then examples of other uses, other meanings, which are not as central. And some of the tests for that are that the prototype is often a simple word. And I'll go back to cup because it works. If I say cup, most people in 21st century Detroit will think of a single handle. They'll think probably of something porcelain or ceramic. I once had a huge fight with a student about whether saucer is included in the prototype, so I won't go there. The fight still rings in my ears 15 years later. And if I say, is this a cup, as I said before, well, we would call it, if we wanted to differentiate, we'd call it a styrofoam cup. A sippy cup for a baby with two handles and a lid is not as good, is not as prototypical as what we drink hot liquids out of. And I say you get to the borders to something that looks more like a mug and fights break out. Pulled out of that might be an abstract meaning. I don't think it doesn't work for cup, it'll work for some of the things I talk about later. An abstract meaning, more schematic, which interacts with the members of the semantic set. Again, semantic set with a prototype and better or less good examples related to the prototype. One thing I want to add is that, interestingly, the examples, the extensions from the prototype, aren't necessarily related to each other. And my pet example, and again, apologies if you've heard this already, is that if you talk about the Stanley Cup, and you talk about a recipe that calls for a cup of butter, Think about the cup of butter, for example. That's a particularly nice one. Well, they both are. Stanley Cup, I didn't know there was a physical cup until I moved to Detroit. I thought it was just the name of the championship. And it never occurred to me there was a cup. World Cup would work the same way. So it gets from the sports trophy to the prize, the abstract idea of a prize, the championship itself, whatever that means. On the other side, what's a cup of butter? Folks, please. Anyone?
For me, it's 2 sticks.
2 sticks of butter. Do you use a cup to measure it? No.
I use a knife.
Exactly. Or you buy them nicely wrapped in the store if you spend a little more on butter, and then you don't have to use a knife. No cup at all, nothing physical. But at least for cooks in North America, 2 sticks of butter is a cup. Recipes will tell you, add a cup, I don't want to think about the recipe that calls for a cup of butter these days, but 2 sticks of butter is a cup. What does that have to do with a sports trophy or a sports championship? Only if you understand where the center is. That's how we make sense of it. That's, we use the same word until it's brought to our attention. Doesn't matter. We use it without thinking. But what we're doing is dealing with a category. So what do we do with this if we're talking about language change? And that's, I want to give you 3 examples and then sort of pull it together at the end. The first example has both a French and an English issue. And those are the words for the writing, well, prototypically, the writing instrument. And you've got this under 3A on your handout. I've given you some examples. Plume is, in French, both pen and feather. And that one is a fairly easy extension. That's my, I could have used that instead of cup, actually, and illustrated the radial set. If we're talking about birds, it's one meaning. Extending from it, historically, is the writing instrument. And I would guess if I just asked for hands around the table, any of you would easily say, well, there was a time when bird feathers were sharpened and dipped into ink, and that was the pen. That's what you wrote with. So that's an easy extension. You've got a use that takes the same word as the material or the instrument. That probably is the best way of putting it. Not terribly interesting at all from this point of view. French keeps both. What I didn't do, and I should have, and I'll offer it as a kind of informal way of checking these things out, I did not look in French dictionaries to see if there was 1 entry or 2. I use as a rule of thumb, and it works out that if dictionary makers who are reflecting usage keep things as 1 entry, the chances are you could stop people in the street and say, birds fly with them, and you write with it, why? And they'll give you some version of what I just said about the instrument being used and then the instrument keeping the name of the source for the instrument. And heaven knows we use things to write with now that don't look very much like quills at all. And they're still called plume in French. So if the meanings have separated radically, you'll find 2 dictionary instances. An example I don't talk about here, but I've studied, is French negation. The word for not, the standard word, is the same word. It comes from the word for step. It's a long, complicated story, and you can ask me about it if you want. Dictionaries have 2 entries. French speakers, native